My name is Ethan. I'm 14 years old, and I live in a small suburban town where everyone knows everyone's business. A couple of months ago, something happened that no one ever expected. It was a school shooting. I still remember the day clearly. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not in our little town where the worst thing we usually faced was a broken water main or a local sports team losing. But on that fateful afternoon, an unimaginable tragedy hit too close to home. I wasn't there that day. I was at home, playing video games like I did every afternoon after school. The news came in the form of a text message from a friend, Amelia, a girl I didn't know all that well, but who'd always been friendly. It was short and simple. Something's going on at Maplewood Elementary. I think there's a shooter. I remember feeling that knot in my stomach, but I didn't know how bad it was. I turned on the TV, my eyes glued to the screen as they showed the chaos unfolding. Ambulances were rushing in, police were everywhere, and reporters were trying to get interviews with people whose faces were etched with confusion and fear. Then, the news hit. Amelia, a 10-year-old girl, had died. She'd been in Miss Lee's arms when it happened. Miss Lee, she was the kind of teacher who was always calm and collected, the one all the students adored. Amelia had been her student, her responsibility. And somehow, in that moment, Miss Lee had tried to protect her. It felt wrong, like someone was telling a terrible joke that no one could laugh at. The shooting wasn't random. It wasn't some faceless event happening in some faraway place. It was right here, in the town I'd lived in my whole life, in the school I used to go to. For weeks after the shooting, everything felt different. People talked about it constantly. Some said things would never be the same again, while others tried to pretend everything was fine. But the truth was, everyone was affected. No one could just go back to living like nothing had happened. The trauma hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then came the news that Miss Lee would be teaching my 8th grade history class. It was hard to wrap my head around. Miss Lee, who had been part of the most terrifying day of our town's history, was coming back. The same Miss Lee who had cradled a dying child in her arms. She walked into our classroom, and it was like something in the air shifted. She was different, though. I couldn't quite place it at first, but there was something unsettling about her. The first time we had a fire drill, she seemed overly alert. She positioned us all in the safest spots. Everyone joked that she was just trying to be thorough, but there was a tension in the air that made it hard to laugh. The drills, which used to be routine and boring, became something else entirely. Miss Lee asked us to move to specific places, to crouch behind desks, to hide in ways that made me feel like I was preparing for the worst. She was obsessing over these drills. The slightest sound made her jump, and she would immediately bark orders. It wasn't normal, not in the way it used to be. The thing that really started to get under my skin, though, was the way she kept looking at Isabella, a girl in my class who resembled Amelia. Isabella had the same long brown hair, the same innocent eyes, and the same bright smile. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then, Miss Lee started calling Isabella Amelia. At first, it was just a slip of the tongue. I figured she was just stressed, tired from everything that had happened. But then it happened again. Amelia, can you move to the corner, please? Miss Lee would ask, or, Amelia, could you come to the front of the class? Isabella would correct her, her voice soft and confused. I'm Isabella, Miss Lee. But Miss Lee would just nod quickly and go back to whatever she was doing, as if nothing was wrong. It was subtle, but it was there, and it unsettled me. Something wasn't right. Miss Lee wasn't the same person she'd been before that tragic day. She wasn't just the teacher anymore. She was someone haunted by what had happened, and in some way, she seemed to be drawing Isabella into her trauma. It was as if Miss Lee was trying to recreate the past, to fix something that could never be fixed. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could say anything. What was I supposed to say to Miss Lee, to Isabella? No one was really talking about it. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken, and no one seemed brave enough to ask the question on everyone's mind. What's really going on with Miss Lee? 2 months had passed since the shooting, but everything felt like it was just beginning. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days after Miss Lee started teaching our history class felt like we were walking on eggshells. Every time she led us through another safety drill, I felt my nerves fray a little more. The drills started innocently enough, evacuations, lockdowns, but they grew more intense with each passing week. Soon, it wasn't just about finding an exit or sitting quietly in the corner of the room. No, Miss Lee had turned the drills into a warped game of survival. It was the day she introduced the active shooter simulation that things spiraled out of control. Class, today we're going to practice under more realistic circumstances, Miss Lee said, her voice clipped and tight. Her eyes flicked around the room, scanning us like we were pieces on a chessboard. I sat at the back, glancing around at my classmates. Most of them were confused. Some were nervous, but none of us could have predicted what was coming. Everyone, get up and move to your assigned spots. Quietly, she instructed, her hand sweeping across the room like she was conducting an orchestra. I remember my heart pounding in my chest as I stood. The moment Miss Lee handed out the instructions, she locked the door, her fingers shaking as she turned the key. I could hear the click of the lock echoing in the silence. I looked at Isabella, sitting in the second row, her face pale. She kept glancing at Miss Lee, who was already muttering to herself under her breath. Get into position, Miss Lee snapped again, her voice harsh. She handed out pieces of paper with handwritten numbers, each corresponding to a hiding spot in the room. When I saw the number assigned to me, I froze. You're in the coat closet, she said, her eyes not meeting mine. It felt like the walls were closing in as I made my way to the small closet at the back of the room. It wasn't just the space that unsettled me. It was how claustrophobic it felt. The closet was barely big enough to fit a person, and I could already hear the others whispering in confusion as they crouched behind desks or huddled under windowsills. Miss Lee switched off the lights. The room plunged into darkness. Stay quiet, she warned, her voice brittle. This is real. That's when the sound came. It was distant at first, muffled, but unmistakable. The rapid-fire cracks of gunshots. Panic shot through me, my heart hammering in my chest. I froze, my hand gripping the closet door so tightly my fingers ached. Gunshots. Real gunshots. I could hear the chaos unfolding in the classroom, the frantic movements of my classmates, the sharp intake of breath. Miss Lee slammed her hand on the door, her breathing erratic. Stay quiet. Don't make a sound, she shouted. I was barely able to breathe, the fear pressing down on my chest like a weight. The gunshots were louder now, closer. They seemed to reverberate through the walls of the room, echoing off every surface. Lock the door, Miss Lee hissed, her voice barely audible over the sound of the shots. No one is leaving. From the crack in the closet door, I could see Miss Lee standing in the middle of the room. She was shaking. Her fingers gripped the edge of a desk like a lifeline. Her eyes were wide, her breath ragged as she darted from one side of the room to the other, ensuring everyone was in their place. But something was wrong. Her gaze kept flicking back to Isabella. She was standing next to the corner, her eyes wide, her mouth trembling. Miss Lee's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say something. Instead, she barked an order. Isabella, get in the closet. Take Amelia's spot. The room went still. My breath caught in my throat. Amelia? Was she talking about the girl who died in her arms? The girl from the shooting? Isabella hesitated, her hands trembling. She looked to Miss Lee for confirmation. Amelia's spot? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Miss Lee insisted, her voice rising, almost frantic. You need to take the spot. It's the only way to be safe. Isabella stood frozen, but finally, she nodded and slowly moved toward the closet. She crawled into the small space where I had been only moments before. I could see her shoulders shaking as she curled into the corner, hiding as though her life depended on it. The gunshots stopped for a moment, and the silence was deafening. My hands were still clutching the doorframe, but I couldn't open the door, couldn't breathe. Then, Miss Lee's voice broke through the silence. You're doing fine, everyone. Stay in position, and don't make a sound. We'll be safe. Her words were more of a plea than a command, the tremor in her voice betraying the calm she was trying to project. In the closet, I could hear Isabella's shallow breathing. Her face was pale, her body trembling with every sound, every shift of movement in the classroom. I wanted to say something, anything, but the fear kept me silent. I wasn't sure if Miss Lee was trying to relive that day or if she truly believed this drill was necessary. But as I huddled there in the darkness, hearing the world outside become more and more chaotic, I realized the simulation wasn't just a practice anymore. It was real. The trauma that Miss Lee had been carrying, the burden of Amelia's death, had seeped into all of us. And now, we were part of her twisted reenactment. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Gunshots rang out once more, and the fear in the classroom was palpable. Miss Lee's grip on control was slipping. The terror was consuming her. It was consuming all of us. I realized then that this wasn't just a lesson about safety. It was about reliving a nightmare. And with Isabella in that closet, taking Amelia's place, it felt like we were all trapped in a memory that couldn't be undone. The terror had become real, and none of us knew how to escape. The days after the terrifying simulation felt like I was walking through a fog. No one really talked about what happened during the fake active shooter drill, at least not openly. Miss Lee kept the same eerie calmness, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, but I couldn't forget the panic in Isabella's eyes as she cowered in that tiny closet, forced to pretend to be someone she could never be. Everything was starting to unravel, though I wasn't sure how or why. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Miss Lee had been acting more like she was still living in the past, haunted by the shooting at the elementary school, haunted by Amelia's death. And now, she was dragging us all into her nightmare. Then came the bombshell. It wasn't a class discussion or a teacher's note. It came from Detective Martinez, the same detective who'd been assigned to investigate the school shooting. He knocked on my door one evening, a grim look on his face. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of everything that had happened when he entered. Ethan, I need to talk to you about something, he said, his voice low, serious. I instantly felt a knot in my stomach. What is it? I asked, trying to hide the worry creeping in. He sat down across from me. We've been digging into the shooting at the elementary school, he began, and we've uncovered something very disturbing. My mind raced. My body froze. The shooting wasn't random, was it? It wasn't what you think, he continued, pausing to make sure I understood. It wasn't some random act of violence. The shooter, well, he wasn't a stranger. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. It was Mr. Davidson, the janitor. He wasn't just a bystander in the chaos. He was the shooter. And Ethan, Miss Lee wasn't just a teacher caught in the crossfire. She was part of it. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Mr. Davidson? The man who'd been working at the school for years? I shook my head. What are you talking about? Miss Lee, she didn't. Detective Martinez raised his hand, stopping me. She did. We've uncovered proof. Mr. Davidson staged the shooting with blanks. He was supposed to fire at students, make it seem real, but it was all part of Miss Lee's plan. She worked with him. She told him what to do. She manipulated him. They were trying to create a realistic trauma experience for the students. I sat there in stunned silence, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what he was saying. The shooting had been planned. It had all been a twisted experiment. Why? Detective Martinez continued. Miss Lee had been working on a dissertation, a twisted research project on trauma-based learning. She wanted to study how children respond to life or death situations, how they adapt to fear. And Mr. Davidson was her accomplice, staging the whole thing under her direction. I could feel the walls closing in on me. But why? I choked out. Why would she? Why would they do this? The detective sighed. Because Miss Lee didn't see it the way we do. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She thought she was doing something important. She wanted to prove something sick. And the worst part? The school's counselor, Mrs. Sanders, was involved too. She was helping Miss Lee manipulate the entire system, enabling this sick experiment. I felt my heart drop. Mrs. Sanders, she was always so kind, so supportive. How could she have been part of this? Detective Martinez's voice softened. We're still piecing it all together, but we've confirmed it. Miss Lee and Mr. Davidson, along with Mrs. Sanders, were working together to turn these children into unwitting subjects in her research. And now, it's all coming to light. Everything I had known, everything I had trusted, was coming undone. The shooting wasn't some random tragedy. It was all part of a sick, twisted plan. And what does this mean for Miss Lee? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective met my eyes. It means she's going to be held accountable. But, Ethan, there's still more to uncover. This isn't just about Miss Lee. It's about how deep the manipulation goes, and how far she was willing to push everyone for the sake of her experiment. I sat back, my mind spinning. Miss Lee, Mr. Davidson, Mrs. Sanders, they had all been part of something darker than I could have ever imagined. The truth felt too big to process, and yet, it was right there in front of me. You're safe now, Detective Martinez added, his tone gentle. We're doing everything we can to bring the full truth to light. But, Ethan, I need you to stay strong. The truth is going to get ugly. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in. The truth was out there now, and the ugly reality of what had been done to us, the trauma we had unknowingly endured, was something I would never forget. But now, the most important question lingered in the back of my mind. What was Miss Lee's real goal in all of this? And how far was she willing to go to finish her twisted experiment? It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. It had been a few days since Detective Martinez's revelation about Miss Lee, Mr. Davidson, and the sickening truth behind the school shooting. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep the web of lies and manipulation had woven itself into the fabric of our lives. I couldn't escape the thought that someone was still watching us, still involved in the conspiracy. I was sitting in my room, trying to focus on my homework, some sort of mindless math problems that felt as empty as my thoughts, when my phone buzzed. I picked it up absent-mindedly, expecting it to be a text from one of my friends. But as soon as I saw the message, my heart skipped a beat. It was a picture of me. The image was grainy, blurry, but unmistakable. It was me, inside that closet, during the simulation. My heart pounded as I stared at the photo, my body freezing in place. There was no way anyone could have taken that photo from the outside. The only way someone could have gotten that shot was if they had been watching from inside the classroom, from a hidden camera. I quickly tapped the screen, pulling up the message. We're watching you. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, to tell someone, but I couldn't. My hands trembled as I typed back the first thing that came to my mind. Who is this? I hit send, but the dots never appeared. Whoever had sent the message wasn't going to answer. They didn't need to. I couldn't sit still anymore. My thoughts spun in circles, the fear building in my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in the unknown, in the paranoia. Had Miss Lee been watching me? Had someone else been helping her? The detective had told me that there were still people out there who had been involved in the whole thing. But this was proof. They were still out there, lurking, watching us. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. My mind raced to make sense of it. The only other person who had been involved with Miss Lee, who had been in the school during the drills, was Mrs. Sanders. I'd seen her meet with Miss Lee more than once, and now it seemed like my suspicions were correct. She wasn't just helping Miss Lee, she was actively involved. I felt the sudden weight of my decision pressing down on me. I needed to tell my parents. But how could I explain this? How could I make them understand that the shooting, the drills, the fake terror we'd lived through, none of it had been real? Before I could process it all, my phone buzzed again. You know too much. Stay quiet. It's not over. The message made my hands shake. I stared at it, my mind reeling, and my heart thundering in my ears. Who was still out there? What did they want from me? I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't let this happen again. I grabbed my phone and dialed Detective Martinez's number, my fingers numb as I tapped the screen. The ringing seemed to go on forever before he finally answered. Detective Martinez? I said, my voice trembling despite myself. It's Ethan. I just got another message. Someone's still watching me. I think they're still involved. I think it's Mrs. Sanders. I heard the detective's breath on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? What's going on? They sent me a picture of me in the closet during the drill. A hidden camera. Someone's watching us. And I think it's her. Mrs. Sanders. She's the one behind all of this. There was a long pause. I could practically hear him thinking on the other side. I'm coming over now, he said finally, his voice firm. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Do not open them for anyone. We need to talk. I hung up without another word, my heart racing as I paced the room. It was all falling apart. The walls I had built to protect myself from the truth were crumbling. I had no idea how deep this went, but I was about to find out. Minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. I ran to the window and peered out. Detective Martinez was standing there, his expression hard as he waved at me to open the door. I unlocked it and let him in. His eyes immediately scanned the room, as if looking for something I couldn't see. What happened? He asked, his voice low. I got a text, I said, showing him the messages. It has to be Mrs. Sanders. She's been working with Miss Lee this whole time. I saw the meeting in the school. She's part of this. And now, someone's still watching us. Detective Martinez frowned, his gaze narrowing. We'll figure this out, but you need to stay calm. Whoever is behind this, they're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I nodded, but the fear hadn't gone away. It was still there, gnawing at me, twisting my stomach into knots. I couldn't stop thinking about the message I'd received. Stay quiet. It's not over. Do you think they'll come after me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They might, he replied, his tone serious. But we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. We're going to make sure they don't get away with this. He pulled out a notebook, scribbling something down. We need to know exactly when these messages started. If Mrs. Sanders is involved, we need proof. I watched him work, trying to keep my mind focused. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. The knock at the door was sharp and unexpected. I wasn't expecting anyone, least of all Mrs. Sanders. But there she was, standing on the front step, her calm, collected demeanor as unsettling as ever. She looked just like she always did, neatly dressed, her eyes betraying no hint of the chaos that had unfolded at the school. But I knew better now. She was just as much a part of the nightmare as Miss Lee. My heart skipped a beat. Ethan, she said with a soft, almost rehearsed smile. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I didn't know how to respond. There was so much anger, so much confusion swirling inside me. I thought I had put everything behind me. I thought the investigation was finally leading to some semblance of justice. But now, seeing Mrs. Sanders standing there, so calm, so composed, I felt the entire weight of the situation press down on me again. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Sanders hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for something, or someone, before she took a small step forward. I wanted to explain. I know this has been difficult for you, for all of you, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. What Miss Lee was doing, it wasn't all bad. She had a vision, Ethan. A vision that could change how we approach trauma. You have to understand. I cut her off before she could say more. You manipulated us. You manipulated me. Her face faltered for just a second, but then she gave me a measured, apologetic look. You don't understand, Ethan. We weren't trying to harm you. We were doing important work. Work that could have helped so many. A chill ran down my spine. Important work? You made us part of an experiment. I shouted, my voice breaking with the anger I had been holding in for so long. You used our trauma, Mrs. Sanders. You used my class, my friends. And you used me. I could see her struggling, trying to maintain that serene front. But there was a crack, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said, her voice still calm. But there was an edge of defensiveness to it now. But it's not what you think. You just need to hear me out. Before she could continue, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see my parents standing in the hallway, their eyes wide with confusion and concern. They had been silent until now, but something about Mrs. Sanders being here had finally caught their attention. My father spoke first, his voice firm but unsure. What's going on here, Ethan? I didn't even look at him. I'm not sure yet, but I think Mrs. Sanders has a lot of explaining to do. At that, Mrs. Sanders gave a nervous laugh, almost as if she thought this was some kind of joke. I've already explained, she said, her voice growing tight. This is a misunderstanding. I just want to talk to Ethan. Can you give us a moment? My mother, who had been standing in the doorway, crossed her arms. No, we need to talk. You're not just going to waltz in here and pretend like you didn't do anything wrong. You've been a part of all of this, haven't you? Her voice grew more assertive, and I could feel her anger rising as she put the pieces together. You're the one who enabled Miss Lee, aren't you? The moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Sanders' eyes flickered, and her calm, practiced mask started to slip. You don't understand, she said, her voice losing some of its earlier calm. You think this is some kind of game? We were trying to make a difference. People are so afraid of trauma, of pain. I was trying to show how much we can learn from it, how we can use it to grow. Enough, I shouted, stepping toward her. You ruined everything. My classmates, my friends, they were your subjects. And you had no right to do that. You took everything from us and turned it into a twisted experiment. At that, Mrs. Sanders finally lost her composure. She clenched her fists, her face flushed with frustration, but she didn't back down. I did what I had to do, she said, her voice now cold. You have no idea how hard this has been for me. You don't know what it's like to fight for something bigger than yourself. I did it for the greater good. My mother shook her head, stepping forward to stand beside me. This isn't about the greater good, Mrs. Sanders. This is about you using your power over these kids, over my son, for something you wanted. I could see it now, her true self, unmasked. She wasn't the well-meaning counselor she had always portrayed herself to be. She was someone who had used her position, her influence, to control and manipulate everyone around her, all in the name of her own misguided agenda. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy with the realization that this woman, this monster, had been part of the nightmare all along. I took a step back, my legs feeling weak under me. I couldn't look at her anymore. The tears I had been holding in for so long started to well up, but I didn't want her to see them. Not now, not when I was finally standing up to her. Just then, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of fear. Was someone else coming to defend her? Another person involved in this twisted conspiracy? But when I opened the door, it wasn't who I expected. Detective Martinez was standing there, his eyes hard as stone. He stepped past me without a word, making his way toward Mrs. Sanders. Mrs. Sanders, he said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension. I think we're done here. Her eyes flickered with panic as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. She backed away, but Detective Martinez moved with precision. You're under arrest for your involvement in the staging of a shooting and for manipulating a school system into conducting harmful, unethical research. Anything you say can and will be used against you. As the detective led her out of the house, I stood there, frozen, unable to move. My parents remained silent behind me, but I could hear the faint sounds of the officer's steps as he took her away. It was over. Mrs. Sanders was going to pay for what she'd done, and maybe, just maybe, we could begin to heal. But even as I stood there, I knew this was just the beginning of the real fight. There was still Miss Lee, there was still the trial, and there was still so much more to uncover. I could only hope that justice would finally be served. The truth about Mrs. Sanders hit like a brick wall. After she left our house that night, the eerie calm of her presence lingering like smoke in the air, I didn't know what to think anymore. I thought I had a grip on everything. The shooting, the drills, Miss Lee's obsession, but now it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting again. Detective Martinez had promised to follow up, but this time, I didn't feel safe waiting around. The weight of knowing that Mrs. Sanders had played a part in this twisted experiment, that she had been in on it from the start, gnawed at me. She had to be the key. She had to have been pulling the strings, manipulating everything behind the scenes. The next day, I barely slept. The images from the fake shooting kept replaying in my mind. The gunshots, the hiding, the terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, still controlling the pieces. As I sat at the kitchen table that morning, sipping my coffee, the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't Mrs. Sanders. It was Detective Martinez. He walked in, his face grim but determined. We've got her, he said simply. I felt my heart leap. What, Mrs. Sanders? He nodded. We've uncovered footage. Mrs. Sanders has been directing Miss Lee's trauma drills for months. It wasn't just Miss Lee calling the shots. Mrs. Sanders was the mastermind. She manipulated the entire school system, including Miss Lee, to carry out this sick experiment. I sat back in my chair, the words sinking in. She was the mastermind? I thought it had been Miss Lee all along, but Mrs. Sanders had been behind it all? I shook my head in disbelief. We've got video evidence of Mrs. Sanders directing the drills. She's on tape telling Miss Lee how to handle the active shooter simulations. She even instructed her on how to manipulate the kids, how to force them into specific hiding spots, how to escalate the fear, how to push the limits of their trauma. We're still piecing it all together, but it's clear now. Mrs. Sanders knew exactly what she was doing, Martinez explained. My stomach twisted. The depth of the conspiracy, the manipulation, it was worse than I had ever imagined. Mrs. Sanders, the counselor I'd trusted, had been using us all as part of a twisted psychological experiment. Do you think Miss Lee knew? I asked, my voice hoarse. Martinez's eyes were hard. It doesn't matter anymore. She may have been manipulated, but she was complicit. The trial will show that. Mrs. Sanders, though, she's the one who planned everything. She orchestrated it all, and now, we've got proof. We're going to bring her down. I could barely wrap my head around it. How could she? Mrs. Sanders had been the one I turned to for comfort after the fake shooting, the one who'd been there with the reassuring words, the calm presence. I had no idea that behind her professional demeanor, she was manipulating everyone in the system. I felt a mix of relief and nausea. Relief that the truth was finally coming out, but nausea because of what it meant for all of us. We had been living in a lie, fed into a scheme we didn't even understand until now. Is she in custody? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She's on her way in. We've got enough to arrest her, The DA is already looking over the case. She's going to face charges for more than just the staged shooting. This is going to go public, Ethan. You're going to hear about it. You and your classmates are victims of a psychological experiment, and she's the one who made it happen. I nodded, trying to process the enormity of it. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I couldn't believe it was real. It felt like the world had just shifted on its axis. The safety of school, of everything I'd known, had been a lie. Martinez stood up, pulling a folder from his bag. We've also found some disturbing connections. Mrs. Sanders had been manipulating not just Miss Lee, but the school's administrative system as well. She was pushing for the creation of trauma-based learning methods, something about proving trauma's effects and how it could be used in education. It was all part of her research, Ethan. She was using your class, using your lives to get data. I felt sick. She'd been using us. We were her experiment. She's in custody now, and Miss Lee will be following soon. Martinez continued, snapping the folder shut. But I need you to stay strong. This is far from over. The weight of his words sunk in, and the fear that had been building in my chest since the first day of those drills seemed to swell again. This wasn't just about one bad teacher. It was about a system, about people who had used their power over us to play with our lives. Thank you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Martinez nodded, his face softening for the first time. You've been through a lot, Ethan. It's going to get better now, but you've got to hold on. The truth is out, and that's the first step. As he left, I stared out the window, my mind still reeling. I had thought I was done with this nightmare, but the truth had only begun to surface. Mrs. Sanders' arrest was a step forward, but the whole system needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. I was still processing what had happened, and it was going to take time. But one thing was certain now, there was no going back. We had to face what had been done to us, face the trauma, and figure out how to rebuild. And the truth, as ugly as it was the first step in that process. It had been a few weeks since Mrs. Sanders' arrest, and even though the truth had come to light, the aftermath was far from over. The weight of everything that had happened, the fake shooting, the betrayal, the manipulation, had left scars on all of us. Some of my classmates seemed to move forward faster than others, but I could feel it inside me, the way it clung to my chest like a constant pressure. We were all still reeling from it. The trauma was embedded in every corner of the school, and it wasn't something that could be erased with a few arrests or a trial. It was part of us now. My family had started therapy, and for the first time in my life, I was going to see a therapist too. My parents were supportive, but I could see how they struggled to cope with everything, too. They tried to shield me from their own feelings, but I could tell it wasn't easy. The nights were the worst. When everyone lay in bed, thinking about what had happened, unable to sleep because of the fear that lingered in the dark. I walked into the therapist's office feeling like I was dragging something heavy behind me. The room was small, comforting in its simplicity. There were no cold, harsh walls or empty chairs. The light was soft, and a potted plant sat in the corner, as if it were trying to keep things calm. Ethan, the therapist said, gesturing to the seat across from her. How are you feeling today? I hesitated, then sat down. I didn't know how to answer that question. I guess I'm okay, I said finally. But I don't really feel okay. I don't think I can ever feel okay about what happened. She nodded, not rushing to fill the silence. What is it that's bothering you the most right now? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It wasn't the first time I'd been asked this, but it felt like the hardest question to answer. I stared at my hands, the same hands that had clenched in fear during the drill, the same hands that had trembled when the gunshots went off. I can't stop thinking about the drills, I said after a moment, my voice quiet. They were so real. It didn't feel like a drill at all. It felt like we were all part of something that was happening for real. The therapist didn't interrupt, letting the words hang in the air. I just keep hearing the gunshots, I continued. And Miss Lee, I can't get the image of her out of my head. She was so scared. She was so out of control. The weight of it all hit me again. That flood of panic, the helplessness of being trapped in a scenario that wasn't supposed to be real, but felt like it was. I closed my eyes, as if that could stop the flood of memories. She was controlling us, I whispered, making us hide. But then I remember Isabella in that closet. She was forced to take Amelia's place. I couldn't help her. My voice cracked, the emotion rising in my chest. The therapist leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. What did that feel like? Watching Isabella take Amelia's place? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It felt like we were living out someone else's nightmare. And I kept thinking, why did it have to be Isabella? The therapist nodded slowly, allowing me the space to process my thoughts. You're still carrying that weight, Ethan. The confusion, the fear, the guilt. It's a lot to handle. I wanted to say something more, but it felt like the words were stuck in my throat. There was more I hadn't said. The way Miss Lee had controlled us. The way Mrs. Sanders had manipulated everything. But I wasn't ready to talk about that yet. The therapist didn't push me, though. She let the silence fill the room, a comforting space to just breathe. After a few moments, she spoke again. It's going to take time. This is all still fresh. But you're here, Ethan. You're taking the steps to heal. That's important. I nodded, though it didn't feel like enough. I didn't know how I would move forward. I didn't know how to shake the fear or the shame of not being able to stop what happened. But for the first time, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't going to let this define me. When the session ended, I walked out of the office with my head held a little higher, even if the weight was still there. The world felt a little less heavy than it had the day before. Back at school, things had changed. Security measures were everywhere now, visible reminders of what we had gone through. The hallways were lined with locked doors, and everyone had to wear badges to get anywhere. There were drills, real drills, about lockdowns and evacuations. It felt like the whole school was living in constant fear, like a bomb was waiting to go off at any moment. But still, we carried on. We had no other choice. Isabella, Marcus, and Sarah were all adjusting in their own ways. Some of us were more open about our struggles, while others kept things bottled up. Isabella had started to keep to herself more than usual, and I could see the same look in her eyes that I had, distant, unsure of what the future held. But when she looked at me, there was a quiet understanding between us, an unspoken connection from what we had been through. Marcus was doing his best to act like everything was normal. He cracked jokes in the hallways, tried to make people laugh, but I could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. It was the same look I saw in the mirror every morning. And Sarah, she was different too. She was quieter, more withdrawn, but she still showed up, still came to school, still tried to keep the pieces together. I admired that about her. She was strong, even when it felt like the world was falling apart. It wasn't easy. It wasn't supposed to be. We were all trying to move forward, to rebuild after everything had been torn apart. But we had each other, and that counted for something. It wasn't going to be a smooth road. Healing never is. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't so scared of the future. It might take time, but maybe, just maybe, we would get through this. And maybe, someday, we could start to feel normal again. The courtroom felt cold. Even the air seemed to carry the weight of everything that had happened, as if the walls themselves were still haunted by the events that had unfolded. I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying not to look at the crowd. There were a lot of people, reporters, police officers, lawyers, but my eyes kept drifting toward the witness stand. Miss Lee was sitting there now, looking small and fragile, almost nothing like the woman who had terrorized our class with her twisted drills. It was surreal, watching her in that chair. Her eyes were wide, almost vacant, and every so often, she would glance at me or Isabella. Her face betrayed nothing, but I could feel the tension in the air. She was being questioned about the drills, the staged shooting, and her connection to Mrs. Sanders and Mr. Davidson, but every word seemed to float past her, like she wasn't fully present in the moment. I wanted to hate her, but instead, I just felt a deep sadness. A sadness for the person she had been and the person she'd become. I'd been called to testify, but I hadn't expected the experience to be as overwhelming as it was. When it was finally my turn, I stood slowly, my legs shaking. The lawyer gestured for me to take the stand, and I walked across the room, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. The weight of it all, the memories of that day in the closet, of Miss Lee's panic-stricken face, of the gunshots, it all came rushing back. But I had to do this. For myself, for everyone. I sat down, and the prosecutor gave me a reassuring nod. "Ethan," she began, her voice gentle. "Can you tell us about the events that led up to the day of the staged shooting?" I nodded, swallowing hard before speaking. It all started with Miss Lee's drills. She started doing these safety exercises. They seemed harmless at first, just normal school stuff. But then she began to focus more and more on hiding spots, specific spots around the room where we'd have to hide during these drills. It got more intense every time. I paused, my thoughts drifting back to those days of fear and confusion. One day, she locked the door. She had us hide, but then things started to feel wrong. The gunshots weren't supposed to be real, but they sounded so real. And she kept us there, telling us to stay quiet, stay still. But there was something in her voice. She was scared. I could tell. I looked over at Miss Lee, her face still unreadable, but I could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She remembered that day. Then, I continued. She asked Isabella to go into the coat closet. She told her to take the position of Amelia, like she was reenacting what had happened before. It was so messed up. I thought I was going to lose it. The prosecutor nodded, signaling that I had said enough. I felt a tremor in my hands as I sat back in the chair. I had just relived that moment. The moment I felt completely powerless. I looked out at my classmates, and for the first time in a long time, I saw them not as victims, but as survivors. We had made it through this, and we would keep going. I glanced at Isabella, who sat in the front row. She gave me a soft, quiet nod, and for a brief second, I saw her strength, her resilience. She had been part of the trauma, just like I had, but we were all here together now, stronger than before. The rest of the trial went on, but as the days passed, the focus shifted to Mrs. Sanders. Her defense team was desperate, trying to paint her as an unwilling participant, as someone who had been manipulated by Miss Lee into participating in the horrors we'd faced. They tried to paint her as a victim of Miss Lee's manipulations, but the evidence against her was too strong. We had the videos, the recordings of Mrs. Sanders directing the drills, coaching Miss Lee on how to push the boundaries of the simulation further, how to manipulate the students into living out these terrifying experiences. There was no denying her role in it all. As Mrs. Sanders sat in the defendant's chair, her face stoic, it was clear to me that she had lost any sense of humanity in the pursuit of her research. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold calculation, as if she still believed that what she had done was justified. The trial ended with Mrs. Sanders being found guilty of orchestrating the entire trauma experiment. She would face the consequences of her actions. Miss Lee, on the other hand, was deemed unfit for trial, her defense claiming she had been manipulated by Mrs. Sanders. She was sent to a psychiatric facility where she would receive treatment for her mental health issues. As the court adjourned, I could feel a small sense of closure, but it didn't erase everything we had been through. It didn't erase the fear, the confusion, or the guilt that had followed us for so long. But it did give us something, justice. And in the end, it was all we could really ask for. I was called to testify again when it came time for the victim's statements, but I didn't mind. It was my chance to speak up, to tell the world what had been done to us. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and I was ready to let the world know that. The road ahead would be long. The scars of the past wouldn't fade easily. But for the first time, I knew we were on the right path. The healing had begun, and that was the most important thing. The first day back at school was unsettling, to say the least. The halls felt quieter, the air thicker, as if the building itself hadn't quite recovered from what had happened. The new security measures were a constant reminder that everything had changed, but the biggest change was within us. We had all been through something that no one should have to endure, and it was hard to pretend like everything was normal. As I walked through the front doors, I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't seen my friends in a few weeks, but I knew the return to school was going to be strange for all of us. We'd been through hell together, and now we had to find a way to live in a world that felt different. The first class I had was with Marcus. We exchanged a nervous smile as we sat down, but neither of us said much. I could tell he was still processing everything, just like me. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an awkward tension that lingered in the air. "How's it feel to be back?" I asked him, breaking the silence. He shrugged, tapping his pen against the desk. "I don't know. Feels like we're just pretending like nothing happened, but it's not the same, right?" I nodded. "No, it's definitely not the same." The day moved slowly after that, each class a reminder of what had been stolen from us. The school had a new normal now, one shaped by trauma. There were more drills, real drills this time, focused on evacuation and lockdown procedures. Every time the bell rang, I felt a jolt of fear. I couldn't help it. Every loud noise, every sudden movement, made my heart race. During lunch, I met up with Isabella, Sarah, and Marcus. Isabella was quiet as usual, but I could see a subtle change in her. There was strength in her now, something more resilient, even if it wasn't obvious. She was sitting with her shoulders slightly straighter, her eyes not as distant as they had been before. It wasn't easy, but we were all finding our way through the wreckage. "Hey," I said softly to her. "How are you holding up?" She met my gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment before she gave a small smile. "I don't know," she replied. "It's been hard, but I think I'm getting there." I could see it. We all were. Slowly but surely, we were starting to heal. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy. But just being here, talking about it, was progress. Sarah spoke up then, her voice steady, though I could still hear the traces of uncertainty. "I'm just glad we're back together. I mean, this whole thing changed us. But we're here. We're still here." I smiled at her. "Yeah, we made it through." The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and we all got up to head back to class. The tension in the air hadn't fully dissipated, but I felt something different. There was a weight lifting off me, just a little, every time we talked about what had happened, every time we supported each other. As the days passed, I started to find small victories in daily life. It was the little things. Being able to walk into a room without feeling like I was being watched. Being able to breathe without that constant pressure in my chest. I still had anxiety. I still had moments where the panic would hit me unexpectedly, but I was learning to cope. We all were. Isabella had started seeing a counselor at school, and I could tell it was helping. She wasn't as withdrawn, and every time I caught her looking at me with a quiet nod, I knew she was doing the hard work of healing. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was I. We had each other. And then there was Marcus. He'd been quiet for a while, but one afternoon, after a particularly heavy therapy session, he looked at me and said, "I think I'm actually starting to feel okay again." It wasn't much, but for him, it was huge. Marcus had always been the class clown, the one who kept things light, but now, I saw that he was carrying the weight of everything we'd been through. And hearing him say that he was starting to heal was a relief for me. The hardest part, though, was still the moments of silence, those moments when we were alone with our thoughts. But in those moments, I began to realize that the past, no matter how hard it had been, wasn't the thing that defined us. We were still writing our story, and as much as the trauma had shaped us, it didn't have to control the future. One afternoon, As I was walking down the hall after class, I found myself standing in front of the classroom where Miss Lee used to teach. The door was closed, but I could see through the window that everything was different now. New desks, new posters on the walls, a new teacher. It felt strange to be standing there, knowing that the room where I had felt so much fear was now just a classroom again. It wasn't the same, but that was okay. I looked down the hall, and I saw Isabella talking to Sarah. I smiled at them and then walked toward them, ready to face whatever came next. "Hey," I said, catching their attention. "Hey," Isabella said, her voice soft but steady. "We'll get through this," I said, feeling the weight of those words more than I ever had before. Together, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but we were moving forward. Slowly, but surely, we were finding our way. The trauma would always be a part of us, but it didn't have to define us. We were stronger now, each of us in our own way, and we would keep going. The past would always be there, lingering in the background, but the future, our future, was something we still had the power to shape. And that thought, that small spark of hope, was enough to carry us forward.